All right, let's talk about chapter 5. Right away, I want you to know the big, like there is a big difference between what we're going to talk about here, the integument and the skin. So there's kind of a subtle difference between the two. The skin is basically the top superficial layers, the top two, which is the epidermis and the dermis. That's considered the skin. The integumentary is the skin and the underlying fatty tissue, called the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous tissue. Some of you have gotten a shot before that goes into the subcutaneous tissue. If you've given a shot of insulin, it has a very small needle, right? Very short needle that goes into the subcutaneous tissue. If you've given yourself a shot of Imitrex, that goes into the subcutaneous tissue. We will also talk about some of the TB skin tests. That goes just a little bit of subdermal in the dermal areas right here, and that's it. So know the difference between the skin versus the whole integument. The skin is just epidermis and dermis. The integumentary system, it's the epidermis, dermis, and the subcutaneous fatty tissue underneath. And we're going to talk about all these different functions in the last part of our slides. So in terms of overview, functions of the integumentary system, kind of makes sense. Protection from everything. Ultraviolet radiation, from water loss, from cuts and bruises and lacerations. Sensation as well. So you can have a sensation of touch, feel, as well as proprioception, as well as vibration, things like that, and pressure. So lots of different sensations by the skin. Temperature regulation, vitamin D production, excretion, and then immunity. We see that you will see some white blood cells here, and that limits the population of bacterium on our skin. But keep in mind, no matter how clean we try to make an area, let's say you're about to have surgery, we want to have that surgery site, that site where we're gonna cut you open. Well, that incision site, we're gonna make it and try to make it as sterile as possible. And even then, people get infections. So there's always going to be a lot of bacterium hanging around our skin. In terms of the skin again, it's the epidermis and dermis. The subcutaneous tissue is part of the integument, but not part of the skin. That subcutaneous tissue, not part of the skin, loose connective tissue, combination of areolar connective tissue and adipose, connecting the skin to the underlying structures. The weird thing about the subcutaneous tissue is that we have a lot of names for it. We call it the hypodermis. We can also sometimes call it the superficial fascia, as well as the subcu. Epidermis, being made out of stratified squamous cells, are avascular. They're nourished by diffusion from capillaries found in the distal layer of the dermis called the papillary layer. So if you take a look right here, this area where it kind of undulates up and down, this top area is called the dermal papillary layer. And in the dermal papillary layer, that's where we will start seeing blood vessels here. There are no blood vessels in the stratified squamous epidermal cells right here. None. So what happens? Well, there are no blood vessels here. If you get a cut, that only goes through the epidermis. If you get that kind of cut, you might not bleed. But there are going to be pain receptors that do go into the epidermis. So it might hurt, but unless you cut deep enough, it's not going to bleed. When we say it's nourished by diffusion from those capillaries, the capillaries that end in the dermal papillary layer, those capillaries allows oxygen to diffuse outwards. As it diffuses outwards, then it goes into these cells, allowing us to bring nutrients to those cells. So there's no connection, and it kind of makes sense that if you're closer to where the blood vessels are, the closer you are, the more nutrients you're going to get, right? You're closer to the blood vessel. the further away we are, the further away from the blood source. The less nutrients you get, the more likely those cells are going to die because of a lack of nutrients. These cells I want you to know: keratinocytes, melanocytes, Langerhans cells, Merkel cells. I want you to know these cells. They're very important. Now, there is in terms of the first one, there's a subtlety here. What are keratinocytes? Keratinocytes are the name of each individual stratified squamous cell. What do I mean by this? When we talk about the actual layer, the cells, we classify it as stratified squamous cells. But when I look at the cell itself, so here, I'm going to show you this. Here's one cell right here. Can I call this one cell, if I'm looking at only one cell, can I call it a stratified squamous cell? No, right? What do we call each one are keratinocytes. As a whole, we call them stratified squamous cells. But when we look at each one individually are considered keratinocytes. Why? Because they contain lots of keratin. So the keratinocytes are the actual cells that make up the stratified squamous cell layers. Again, a little bit of subtlety there, right? Melanocytes contribute to skin color. Melanin produced by these cells are then transferred to the keratinocytes. Everybody has the same number of melanocytes, but due to region where you are born, region where your ancestors are born, you're going to have different activation of those melanocytes. And those melanocytes are going to be causing us to be darker, closer to the equator. So if you look at people that live closer to the equator, right, Sub-Saharan Africa, you look at the people in Papua New Guinea, the Aborigines, right, that are in, if you look at them in, the Aborigines in Australia, right, every people that are close to the equator, they're going to be darker. The hair color is going to be very, very dark. Even the iris of the eyes are going to be very dark. And it's really cool how this happens, guys. All right? Why is it so cool? It's because our body, through many generations, helps protect us. You can imagine, how bad would it be if you were, let's say, not right now presently living, right, in that area, but let's say 1,000 years ago, you were living in Africa, you're living in real, Sub-Saharan India, or in Indonesia, where I'm from, and now you're in the equator, and you have all that heat, all that sunlight bouncing off your skin all the time. And now you don't have sunglasses to wear, you don't have sunscreen to protect you, you barely have clothes to protect you. How bad would it, and you don't even have hats really to protect you, right? How bad off would you be if you have blonde hair, blue eyes, and light skin, right? You will be in deep trouble then, right? If you have blonde hair, blue eyes, and white skin, if you're living in the Sub-Saharan Africa region, you better find some sunglasses or else you're gonna burn your retinal cells. You better find a hat or else you're gonna burn your scalp over and over again, right? You better wear a nice long shirt or else you're going to burn your skin all over. And you know what happens then? You increase the risk of cancers from it. So do not ever be we're so worried about colorization and everything, right? We are the way we are because of what our parents, ancestors, where we're from. So my eyes have real dark irises. Why? Because my ancestors lived in Indonesia for multiple generations, right? If you go to people living in Papua New Guinea, if you go look at the Aborigines in Australia, right? The hair is very coarse. Why is it very coarse? For protection. It's dark, it's very coarse, right? Why? For protection from the sun. So then you can have decreased chances of actually burning your scalp. Burning the scalp is not fun, right? And if you burn the scalp and then you have to be in that condition again the next day, you can imagine after a couple of weeks of this, you're gonna see some major changes in your body. So these melanocytes, right, are pretty interesting in how they function. Now what else? As we get further away from the equators, that's when it becomes a little bit more viable to have lighter skin, to have lighter color irises, to have lighter color hair. And those regions, then you see people with those traits. So these melanocytes allows us to kind of have colorization, which is pretty cool. And we're gonna see later on, as we talk about it in a few minutes, these melanocytes activate when there's increased ultraviolet radiation. So no matter how dark you are, you can get darker from this. These Langerhans cells, the next type of cells, pretty cool as well. These are the immune cells. It allows us to maintain a healthy bacterial flora. So then, if we have a lot of healthy bacterium in our skin, none of that super bad stuff can come in and populate that area. These Langerhans cells are white blood cells. They just eat up any of the bad bacterium. So then we have, right? So then we have, nice healthy population of somewhat good bacterium. Again, these bacterium will and can cause infections, but they don't if your skin is intact. Is when there's a break in the skin that you will see the infections, because now there's a pathway for the bacterium to go into your dermis, where your blood vessels are. And now once it taps into blood vessels, it has a blood source, it has nutrients, and it can grow. Merkel cells, or disc, they detect light touch and superficial pressure. And we'll talk about these coming up. So this light touch receptors for Merkel's disc helps us identify different types of patterns. If I ask you right now to go into your pocket and without looking, find your car keys. Without looking, I bet every single one of you that have car keys, right? Every single one of you that have car keys can tell just by touch which are your car keys. Some of you might be able to tell what your house keys are like compared to your work keys just by touch, without even looking. Why? It's because of these receptors. These receptors for a light touch allows us to feel the different textures, the different ridges of our keys. And once we feel it, our brain then deciphers it as saying, you know what, these textures only found in my house keys. They're slightly different from the car keys. And right away, you know that it's your house keys. Or how many of us are like taking a night class, it's dark outside, so you reach into your pocket and you immediately grab your car keys without even thinking about it. All you did was just grab it. How are you able to just grab it without looking? By the sense of touch. Really, really sensitive. Now, as these cells, and they all start off from the bottom here, as these cells are pushed upwards, they start to be pushed further and further from the blood source. Now, what do I mean by this movement upwards is called desquamation. Cells of the deeper layer undergo mitosis. Usually, it is the deepest layer of cells that undergo mitosis. So the mitosis occurs at this bottom layer of cells in a region we call the stratum basale. These are the true functionally active cells that allows us to heal and then regrow our epidermis. So what happens, right? Let's say you get a cut up here. It doesn't go into the dermis. You just get a very superficial cut. As you get a superficial scrape, what happens? Well, now after a couple days, cells underneath starts to move upwards. And how it happens is this. So I have space up here because all these cells up here are dead because of the cut. You've removed them. What happens then? The cells on the bottom starts to undergo mitosis. As they undergo mitosis, these cell layers up here will cause us, right, to push other cells upward. So as this cell undergoes mitosis, a new cell will kind of move up into the next layer. As a new cell pushes up into the next layer, all these other cells also gets pushed up a layer. That is a desquamation, right? Is that new cells pushes all the older cells upwards and further away from the blood vessels, which are deep inside here. The further away these cells get, the more likely they are going to die because you're going to be so far away, you can't receive any nutrients at that point. And it's okay. We want those multiple layers of dead cells. The more layers, the more protection, right? The great thing is this. If you cut off a layer here, even all the layers down here, if the bottom layer is intact, you will always have regeneration, regrowth without scarring. The only time you scar is when this layer of cells also die, right? And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So again, desquamation process is a movement of those cells where newer cells pushes the older cells upwards. And what happens? The older cells, after many rounds of division, gets pushed all the way up, and then you hopefully exfoliate it away. Keratinization is as the cells move up, they fill with keratin, they die, and the keratin is real thick and tough. Keratin is what we find in our nails. It's what we find even in the horn of rhinoceros. Real thick keratin found there. So it is a very strong, very dense type of protein, this keratin. In some ways it's really good because it's strong and dense, but it's also drying. So there's a limit to how much keratin we want, in other words. Let's talk about the stratas, and then we'll take a little break. The epidermal stratas. Again, we have many, many names for layers. We don't just call them layers. We sometimes call them stratas or stratum. So the first type of strata is the most important one, the stratum basale. Those are the cells that are cuboidal looking, right? Those cuboidal looking cells are also anchored to the basement membrane here. So in terms of those cells, in terms of the